The silence is the first thing that gets you. Not the gentle, living silence of a forest, the kind I've known my whole life, filled with the whisper of wind in the pines and the distant rustle of a squirrel. This was a dead silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb sound before it could even form. The birds had stopped singing an hour ago. The chatter of chipmunks, the snapping of twigs under the feet of unseen creatures, all of it had just ceased. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my ears and the harsh rasp of my breath fogging in the crisp autumn air. For 3 days I'd been tracking the ghost buck. That's what we called him back at the lodge. A magnificent 12-point beast that was more legend than reality. Old Man Hemlock swore he'd seen him 10 years ago. A pale, almost silvery coat, moving like smoke through the thickest parts of the woods where no man dared to follow. Every year a few of us would try. It became a ritual, a fool's errand to prove we still had the grit to challenge the wild. This year, I was the fool. And I'd gotten a glimpse. Just a flash of that spectral hide through a thicket of ironwood, and I was hooked. I left my planned route, my map, and my common sense behind, pushing deeper into the uncharted parts of the national forest than I ever had before. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the canopy in hues of orange and blood red, when the trail finally gave out. The buck had vanished as they always said he did, and I was well and truly lost. That's when the silence fell, and a deep primal unease started to crawl up my spine. This wasn't my forest anymore. The trees seemed older here, their branches twisted into arthritic claws, their bark thick and dark like scarred skin. The very air felt thin, ancient. I checked my compass. The needle was spinning lazily, confused. My GPS? No signal for miles. Classic rookie mistakes, born from the arrogance of a veteran hunter who thought he knew better. I decided to follow a ridge, hoping to get a vantage point before dark. The ground was soft and spongy, with centuries of fallen pine needles, muffling my footsteps and adding to the oppressive quiet. I felt watched. It's a feeling every hunter knows, the sensation of unseen eyes on your back. Usually it's a doe you haven't spotted, or a coyote. But this was different. This felt intelligent, patient. I unslung my rifle from my shoulder, the cold steel a small, inadequate comfort in my hands. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a rock formation, a trick of the fading light, but as I drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a cabin, or what was left of one. It was built low to the ground, dug into the side of the hill so that the earth itself seemed to be swallowing it whole. The logs were a dark, mottled gray, almost black, and covered in a thick carpet of moss that glowed a vibrant, sickly green in the twilight. There was no path leading to it, no clearing around it. The ancient trees grew right up to its walls, their roots snaking over the foundation like grasping fingers. It looked less like something that was built and more like something that had grown here, a natural tumor of the forest. My first thought was relief, shelter, a place to wait out the night. But the closer I got, the more that feeling was replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The single window was a dark, vacant square, like a hollow eye socket. The door, made of thick, rough-hewn planks, hung slightly ajar, a black slit of invitation into the deeper darkness within. There was no chimney, no sign of life, no hint that it had been occupied in the last century. It was a forgotten place, a grave with a roof. Every instinct I had, honed by 30 years of navigating the wilderness, screamed at me to turn back. To find a tree to climb, to face the cold and the dark rather than step 1 foot closer to that place. But I couldn't. It was like a magnet, pulling me in with a morbid curiosity that outweighed my fear. I had to know what was inside. I approached slowly, my rifle held at the ready, stepping carefully over the gnarled roots. The air grew colder as I neared the door, the temperature dropping a good 10 degrees. A strange smell hit me. Not the smell of rot or decay I expected, but the scent of dust, cold stone, and something else, something dry and sterile, like the air in a tomb. I put my hand on the warped wood of the door. It was cold as ice, Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. It swung inward without a sound, opening into a single, small room. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the doorway, cutting through the thick gloom. And what I saw made the breath catch in my throat. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't ransacked by animals or time. It was preserved. In the center of the room was a simple, hand-carved wooden table and a single chair. On the table was a wooden plate, a tin cup, and a fork, and on the plate was food, a piece of bread and what looked like a chunk of dried meat. But it was all covered in a thick gray layer of dust, petrified, as if the person sitting there had simply vanished mid-meal 100 years ago. It was a perfect, silent tableau of a life interrupted. I took a hesitant step inside, my boots scuffing on the dirt floor. My gaze swept the room. There was a simple cot in the corner, a threadbare blanket folded neatly upon it. Against the far wall, a small stack of what looked like canvases was leaning, their faces turned away. Everything was coated in that same suffocating layer of dust. It was a time capsule, a moment frozen and forgotten. I felt a strange sort of sadness, a reverence for the lonely soul who had lived and died here. Then my eyes fell to the wall above the cot. From the doorway I had thought it was just the rough texture of the logs, but now in the dim light I could see that the entire wall, from floor to ceiling, was covered in scratches, tally marks. Not just a few, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of them, scratched into the dark wood with something sharp. They were grouped in sevens, an endless obsessive calendar of days, a lifetime of isolation carved into the walls of this tiny prison. My heart hammered against my ribs. Who could live like this? How long had they been here? I ran my flashlight from my pack over the wall, the beam cutting through the gloom, revealing the sheer scale of the markings. They covered every inch of available space. My light followed the last wavering line of scratches near the floor. It ended in a final, diagonal slash through a group of 6, the end of a week. And then, just beside it, set apart from all the others, was a single, solitary mark. It was cleaner than the rest, deeper. The wood beneath it was still pale, almost white, against the grime of the wall. It looked like it had been scratched there this morning. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just cold, it felt like it had turned to slush in my veins. A single, fresh scratch. The implication was so utterly impossible that my mind simply refused to process it. I knelt, my knees cracking in the dead quiet, and aimed my flashlight beam directly at the mark. The wood shavings were still there, tiny pale curls resting on the grime-caked floorboards below. Someone had been here, not a century ago, not a year ago, today, minutes ago. My head snapped up, and I swept the flashlight beam across the single room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The thick, uniform layer of dust was undisturbed. On the table, on the chair, on the cot, on the floor, everywhere. There were my footprints leading from the door, and that was it. No other tracks, no sign of entry or exit. It was as if a ghost had reached through the wall, carved a single line to mark its existence, and vanished. Panic began to bubble in my chest, hot and sharp. I backed away from the wall, stumbling over my own feet, my rifle feeling as heavy and useless as a chunk of lead. Who? How? The questions screamed in my mind, but the suffocating silence of the cabin offered no answers. I was trapped in a paradox. The evidence of ancient abandonment was everywhere, yet the proof of immediate presence was right there, carved into the wall. My eyes darted to the single, grimy window. It was a solid pane of old, warped glass, caked with so much dirt that it was barely translucent. No way in or out of there without shattering it. I looked at the door, still slightly ajar. I hadn't heard it open or close since I arrived. I hadn't heard anything at all. The silence itself was the loudest thing in the room. My training, the ingrained discipline of a lifetime spent in the wild, finally kicked in, wrestling the panic back down. I couldn't afford to lose my head. Not here, not now. I needed information. I had to treat this place not as a shelter, but as a scene. Something had happened here. Something was still happening here. My gaze fell on the stack of canvases leaning against the far wall. They were the only personal items in the room besides the petrified meal on the table. The person who had carved those tally marks, the person who had perhaps carved the last one, must have made these. It was the only place left to look for answers. I approached them cautiously, my footsteps sounding like explosions in the stillness. I shone my light on the stack. There were about a dozen of them stretched over crude, handmade frames. They were covered in the same gray dust as everything else. With a trembling hand, I reached out and took the first one from the front. It was surprisingly light, the canvas brittle with age. I turned it over. The painting was crude, almost childlike in its execution. It was a landscape of the forest, the trees painted as simple brown trunks with green blotches for leaves. In the center of the painting was the cabin. This very cabin. It looked newer, the logs a lighter shade of brown, but it was unmistakably the same place. It was a simple, lonely painting, an artist capturing his home. I felt a small pang of pity. I set it down carefully and picked up the next one. It was another landscape, same perspective, but this one was different. The colors were darker, muddier. The trees seemed taller, their branches painted with sharp, jagged strokes, making them look like grasping claws, reaching for the little cabin. The sky was a bruised purple. A sense of unease crept off the canvas. This wasn't a happy home. This was a fortress. The third painting made me take an involuntary step back. It was a night scene. The cabin was a small dark square with a single point of yellow light in the window. The forest around it was a mass of black and deep blue shadows. But it wasn't empty. Between the trees, painted so subtly I almost missed it, was a shape. It was tall, unnaturally so, and impossibly thin. It was just a silhouette, a sliver of darkness against the deeper dark, but it had a form. Long, spindly limbs, a narrow torso, and a head that seemed just a little too small for its frame. It was standing perfectly still, watching the cabin. My mouth went dry. I started flipping through the canvases faster, my dread growing with each one. The fourth painting. The creature was closer, at the edge of where a clearing might have been. The artist had tried to add details now. The skin was a pale, sickly white. There were no discernible features on its face, just a smooth, blank canvas. The fifth painting. It was peering from behind a thick pine, its long, multi-jointed fingers wrapped around the trunk. The sixth. There were two of them. My hands were shaking now. These weren't just paintings. They were a record, a bestiary. The tally marks on the wall weren't just counting days of solitude. They were counting days of survival. This person hadn't been a hermit. They had been a prisoner, besieged by these things. How long had they held out? Looking at the sheer number of marks on the wall, it must have been years. A lifetime. I finally reached the last canvas. It was leaning at the very back of the stack, and it felt different. The wood of the frame wasn't as dry, the canvas not quite as stiff. My fingers came away with less dust. It was newer than the others. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drum against the silence. This was it, the last message, the end of the story. I took a deep, shuddering breath and turned it around. My mind braced for a final, horrific depiction of the pale creature, perhaps breaking through the door or a window. But that's not what I saw. My brain stuttered, struggling to comprehend the image. It was a painting of the inside of the cabin. The perspective was from the corner, near the stack of canvases where I was standing. The detail was meticulous. The dusty table with its plate and cup. The simple cot against the wall, covered in tally marks. The rough-hewn door, hanging open just a crack, a sliver of the gloomy, fading daylight visible through it. And framed in that doorway was the figure of a man. He was seen from behind, wearing a camouflage jacket and a hunter's cap, with a rifle slung over his right shoulder. It was me. It was a painting of me, arriving at this cabin just minutes ago. A wave of vertigo washed over me, so intense I had to put a hand against the wall to steady myself. How was this possible? It was a perfect depiction. My jacket, my rifle, the way I stood. It was impossible. My eyes scanned the painting frantically, trying to find an explanation, a trick of the light, anything, and then I saw it. The painting wasn't finished. The artist had captured my arrival, but the rest of the scene was still dark, the shadows in the cabin's interior deep and menacing. But in the corner of the painting, the very corner where I was now standing, the artist had begun to paint another figure. It was just a few faint strokes of pale, white paint, barely visible against the dark background, but the shape was unmistakable, the beginning of a long, spindly arm, and the suggestion of a featureless face materializing from the shadows right behind the painted version of me. The artist wasn't painting a memory. They were painting what was happening right now. A cold spot formed on the back of my neck, and I heard a sound that wasn't in the painting, the soft, slow scrape of a boot on the dusty floorboards directly behind me. There are moments in your life that stretch, where a single second feels like an eternity. The scrape of that boot behind me was one of them. Time warped, my entire world narrowing to that one sound. It was a dry, rasping noise, the sound of leather on dust and wood, a sound that should have been impossible in this tomb-silent room where I was supposedly alone. My muscles locked up. Every instinct, every fiber of my being, screamed at me to spin around, to bring my rifle to bear on whoever was there. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a fear so profound, so elemental, it bypassed my conscious mind entirely. My breath hitched in my lungs, and the painting in my hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The painting. My eyes were still glued to it, to the horrifying image of me in the doorway and the pale, skeletal arm beginning to form in the shadows behind me. It was a prophecy and a warning, delivered a split second too late. The artist hadn't been painting what was happening. They were painting what was about to happen. A low voice whispered from the darkness behind me, and the sound shattered the spell of my paralysis. It was a dry, cracking whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "You shouldn't have come here." I reacted purely on instinct. I dropped the canvas and spun, bringing the rifle up, my finger already finding the trigger. My heart hammered against my ribs, expecting to see one of the pale, nightmarish creatures from the paintings. But the figure standing there, not 10 feet away in the deepest shadows of the cabin, was a man. He was old. Older than any man I had ever seen. His skin was like wrinkled parchment stretched tight over a skull. His eyes sunk so deep into their sockets they were just two dark pools of shadow. He was rail-thin, dressed in clothes that were little more than rags, the same kind of homespun fabric I'd seen in museums depicting 19th-century pioneers. He held a paintbrush in one trembling, skeletal hand, its bristles tipped with a smear of pale, white paint. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who by all accounts should have been dead for a century. The man from the tally marks. The artist. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a croak. My rifle was leveled at his chest, but the threat felt hollow. He didn't seem afraid. He just looked tired. Impossibly, soul-crushingly tired. "I am the Watcher," he rasped, his eyes flicking from me to the painting I had dropped on the floor. "And you have brought them with you." "Brought who?" I demanded, taking a half-step back towards the door, towards the fading light. The sun had almost set completely now, and the interior of the cabin was being swallowed by a thick, inky blackness. My flashlight beam was the only thing holding the shadows at bay. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his trembling hand and pointed a long, bony finger past me towards the open doorway. "You led them here. Their hunger follows the living. It follows the loud." I didn't want to look. I knew with a chilling certainty that if I turned my head, I would see one of them. The pale, spindly things from the canvases, standing right there at the tree line, drawn in by my clumsy, noisy arrival. But the old man's gaze was so intense, so full of a century of terror, that I couldn't help it. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The forest was silent. The last vestiges of sunlight were gone, leaving only a deep twilight gloom. I saw nothing, just the dark, twisted shapes of the ancient trees. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "You don't see them with your eyes," the old man whispered, his voice full of a strange pity. "Not at first. You feel them. They are the silence. They are the cold spot on your neck. They are the stillness when the birds stop singing." My blood turned to ice again. The silence, the cold, the feeling of being watched. It hadn't been my imagination. It had been them, tracking me, following me to this place, to this man. "What are they?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The quiet folk," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "They were here before the trees. They feed on warmth, life, sound. I have kept them at bay. I stay quiet. I stay still. I don't let my heart beat too loud. I have been here so long. I am almost as cold and quiet as they are. They almost don't see me anymore." He looked down at his own hands, so thin they were almost translucent. "But you are a bonfire in the dark. So much noise, so much life, so much food." A floorboard creaked above us. Both our heads snapped up. My flashlight beam shot upwards to the low ceiling. There was no attic, just the rough-hewn planks of the roof. But as my light danced across them, I saw it. A dark, wet stain was spreading on the wood, like water seeping through. But it wasn't water. It was thick, and it was black. As we watched, a single black droplet swelled, hung for a moment, and then fell, landing on the dusty floor between us with a soft plop. It wasn't liquid. It was a thick, tar-like substance that sizzled faintly as it hit the dirt. "They're on the roof," the old man breathed, his face a mask of pure horror. "They've never come this close. They've never touched the cabin." Another drop fell, then another. Then a steady dripping began from multiple spots on the ceiling. Plop, plop, plop. The sound was maddening in the intense quiet. The black ooze was starting to form small, viscous puddles on the floor. The sterile, dusty smell of the cabin was being replaced by a new odor, acrid and oily, like burnt plastic and rot. "The paintings!" I yelled, suddenly understanding. "That's how you survive? You paint them?" He nodded, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the ceiling. "I paint what is about to be. It fixes them, holds them. As long as their image is captured, as long as the story of the moment is told, they cannot fully enter it. It's the only rule they seem to obey. But I am old. My hands shake. I am running out of canvas." His gaze met mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something other than fear. It was desperation. "I painted you arriving. To hold you in the moment. To give me time." "Time for what?" Before he could answer, a loud scratching sound came from the outside wall, the sound of 1,000 sharp fingernails dragging down the ancient logs. It was followed by a low, guttural vibration that I felt more than heard, a hum that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the cabin and resonate deep within my bones. The dripping from the ceiling intensified, the black ooze now raining down in a steady shower. The old man stumbled back, grabbing a new, blank canvas from behind the stack. He fumbled with a jar of murky water and his paints, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the brush. "I have to paint it now," he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy with panic. "I have to paint what happens next, or it will happen to us." "What happens next?" "Ah," I screamed back, my flashlight beam darting wildly around the room, catching the glint of the black puddles spreading across the floor like an encroaching tide. The scratching was on all the walls now, a deafening cacophony. A splintering crack came from the door as something immense threw its weight against it. The old man wasn't looking at the door, or the walls, or the ceiling. He was looking directly at me, his eyes wide with a terrible, chilling certainty. His brush, loaded with black and red paint, hovered over the fresh canvas. "One of us doesn't leave this room," he whispered, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "That's the only story they will accept now. The only one that will make them quiet again." The doorframe groaned, the wood beginning to splinter and buckle inward. He stared at me, his gaze an agonizing mix of apology and resolve. "I'm so sorry. I have to paint you." A primal, cold fury surged through me, eclipsing the fear. "Like hell you will," I snarled. My world had devolved into a cacophony of horror, the splintering door, the scraping claws on the walls, the steady, sickening drip of black ichor from the ceiling, but in that moment all of it faded. There was only the old man, the canvas, and his death sentence. He was going to paint me into oblivion to save himself. He was going to sacrifice me to the things outside. The main beam of the doorframe let out a final gunshot crack, and the door blew inward, torn from its ancient hinges, crashing to the floor with a deafening boom. And in the opening, silhouetted against the pitch black of the forest, stood one of them. The paintings hadn't done it justice. It was a nightmare-given form. Taller than a man, so thin its bones seemed to strain against the pale, almost luminous skin. Its limbs were too long, bent at impossible angles. It had no face, just a smooth, blank expanse of skin, where features should have been. It stood perfectly still, a silent, patient executioner. The old man screamed, a high, thin wail of pure terror, and his brush touched the canvas. He began to paint with a desperate, frantic energy, his strokes swift and sure despite his shaking hands. I didn't hesitate. I wasn't going to be a sacrifice. I wasn't going to be a story on a canvas. I raised my rifle, but I didn't aim it at the creature in the doorway. I aimed it at the old man. "Drop the brush!" I roared over the din. He ignored me, his entire being consumed by the act of creation, his eyes wide and unblinking as he translated the horror of the moment onto the canvas. I could see the image taking shape, the wrecked doorway, the invading creature, and the figure of a hunter, me, being enveloped by the shadows. He was painting my end. With a snarl, I shifted my aim. I wasn't a murderer. I couldn't shoot him. But I could shoot the painting. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle's blast was deafening in the tiny cabin, a shocking eruption of sound and fire. The canvas exploded, ripped from the old man's grasp as the bullet tore through its center, showering the room with splinters of wood and shredded fabric. For a single, blessed moment, everything stopped. The creature in the doorway froze. The scraping on the walls ceased. The dripping from the ceiling paused mid-drip. The old man stared at the ruined painting, his mouth agape, his face a mask of utter disbelief and despair. "What have you done?" he whimpered, his voice cracking. "You've broken the story. Now there are no rules." As if to punctuate his words, the creature in the doorway unfolded. It moved with an unnatural, jerky fluidity, like a stop-motion puppet brought to life, its long limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. It took a step into the room, and then another. It ignored me completely. Its blank, featureless face was turned towards the old man, towards the storyteller. "It's the noise," the old man choked out, scrambling backwards, away from the advancing horror. "The rifle shot. It was too loud. It drew its full attention. The quiet folk, he'd called them. They fed on life, on warmth, on sound. And my rifle shot had been a dinner bell." The creature continued its slow, inexorable advance on the terrified old man. I was a bonfire, yes, but he was the one who had tended this place for a century. He was the center of this quiet, cold world. The story had broken, and now the main character was about to be written out. I could have run. The doorway was clear. I could have sprinted out into the night and left him to his fate, the fate he had so callously chosen for me just moments before. But looking at his terrified, pathetic form, cowering on the floor, and the unholy thing bearing down on him, I couldn't. This was my fault. I had fired the shot. I had broken his strange, terrible magic. "Get up!" I yelled, grabbing his thin arm and hauling him to his feet. He was light as a bundle of sticks. "We have to go. Now!" He just shook his head, his eyes locked on the approaching creature. "There is nowhere to go. They are the forest. They are the silence." "Then we make some noise," I screamed. An idea, desperate and insane, blooming in my mind. I leveled my rifle at the ceiling and fired again. And again. And again. I emptied the magazine in a chaotic, roaring volley, the sound waves physically shaking the small cabin. Wood splintered, dust rained down, and the black ichor splattered everywhere. The creature flinched, its smooth head twitching as if in pain. The scraping outside the walls started again, but now it was frantic, agitated. "My paints!" the old man shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the corner. I didn't understand, but I didn't have time to ask. I grabbed his arm and dragged him towards the back wall, away from the thing that was now just a few feet away. I fumbled for a new magazine, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and slammed it home. "What about your paints?" "The white," he gasped, his eyes wild. "It's not paint. It's ground from the rocks in the deep caves. It holds the quiet, the opposite of them. It's what keeps them from seeing me clearly." The creature reached for him, its long, multi-jointed fingers stretching out. I shoved the old man behind me and fired point-blank into the thing's chest. The bullet passed right through it, hitting the back wall with a loud thwack. The creature didn't even seem to notice. It didn't have blood or organs. It was just a shape made of silence and shadow. I kicked over the small table holding his painting supplies. Jars shattered. Pigments puffed into the air. One jar, larger than the others, rolled across the floor. It was filled with a thick, chalky, white paste. The old man dove for it, clutching it to his chest like a holy relic. "What do we do?" I yelled, backing away as the creature continued to advance. More of them were crowding the doorway now, tall, spindly silhouettes against the dark. The old man looked at me, a century of solitude and terror in his eyes. And then he smiled. It was a ghastly, skeletal grin. "You were right, Hunter. A new story. A loud one." Before I could react, he unscrewed the lid of the jar, and with a strength I wouldn't have thought possible, he threw it. Not at the creatures, but at the small, stone hearth in the corner of the cabin, the one I had noted had no chimney. The jar shattered against the stones, splashing the thick, white paste all over the dry, ancient wood of the walls, and the tinder-dry moss clinging to the hearthstones. Then he pulled a small flint and steel from his pocket. "I was always so afraid of fire," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "So afraid of the warmth, the noise." He struck the flint. A single bright spark flew through the air. The white paste ignited with a soundless, violent whoosh. A brilliant white flame erupted in the corner of the cabin, impossibly bright, impossibly clean. It wasn't hot. In fact, a wave of intense cold washed over the room, a cold that felt like the void between stars. The light was absolute, burning away the shadows, and where it touched the creatures, they recoiled, their pale forms seeming to thin and dissipate like smoke in a strong wind. They let out a sound for the first time, a high-pitched, tearing shriek that sounded like nails on a blackboard and tearing silk. "Go!" the old man screamed at me, his face illuminated by the eerie, cold light. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the burning wall, a look of profound peace on his face. He had been a prisoner for a lifetime, and he was finally tearing the prison down. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, bursting through the crowd of shrieking, dissipating shapes in the doorway and out into the blessed, cold night. I didn't look back. I just ran, fueled by terror and adrenaline, crashing through the undergrowth, away from the unnatural white light that was now pouring from the cabin's window and door, setting the ancient forest into stark, ghostly relief. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing at the base of a towering oak. When I finally dared to look back, the light was gone. The forest was dark again, and for the first time since I'd entered this cursed part of the woods, I could hear the gentle, living sounds of the night. An owl hooted in the distance. The wind whispered through the pines. The silence had been broken. The story was over. I don't know what happened to the old man. Maybe he was consumed by his cold fire. Maybe he found his peace. Maybe he simply became as quiet as the things he fought for so long. All I know is that I found my way out of the woods the next morning, and I never went back. I never told anyone the full story. Who would believe it? But sometimes, on a quiet night when the wind dies down, I think I can still feel it. That heavy, watching silence. And I know the quiet folk are still out there, waiting for the next story to begin.